Our speakers are different this time. Instead of going to the Humanities Council, thank you, John, we're getting expert speakers right from our own board. And John Hopper will be the taller person. Was a summer resident of Meredith on Bear Island. He grew up in New Jersey and summered on Bear Island since he was born. And he's quite the historian. He has helped us tremendously in trying to organize some of the town reports that go back a zillion years. And he and John Edgar, who you probably all know is our community development person with the town, have both worked on tonight's talk. And John Hopper's wife makes really good desserts, and John Edgar is cooking up the hot dogs next week. So we got some good people cooking, but they also have been really working hard for this presentation. And we're lucky enough to have Wes Bauer from the State Historical Society with the egg that everybody wants to see. So I think it's time to let them do the talk and let us know what this is all about. And Seneca Lads, who's the reason we're here.
So tonight's program is going to be in essentially three parts. In the beginning, John will unpack Seneca Ladd's life story and his accomplishments to try to get a better sense of who this gentleman was, who was integral to the development of Meredith Village. Second, I'll follow with some background information on the Mystery Stone, and then finally we'll take questions and answers. As was indicated, Wes Ballard is up here from the New Hampshire Historical Society, so we're indebted to them for sharing the return of the stone for tonight's program. So we'll have plenty of time for back and forth at the end of the program. But before John gets started, I wanted to stir your curiosity about Seneca Ladd a bit. And I wanted to share with you a few quotes from one of the reference materials that we used to create this program. This volume is an often cited publication of the history of Merrimack and Belknap counties. Within this, published in 1885, and so within this publication, there are histories of all the towns within the counties, one of which is Meredith. So there's a 10-chapter history of Meredith that was published contemporaneous with Seneca Ladd's life. And so there's a significant amount of material in this book dealing with his role in the community, his role relative to the bank, and there's also a piece on the quote-unquote curious relic, meaning the Mystery Stone. And so I just want to point that out, that we'll be citing this a few times. So to sort of stir things up a little bit, to think about who was this fellow Seneca Ladd, I wanted to share with you a couple excerpts from that book. And keep in mind that when this book was published, Seneca Ladd was 66 years old, still alive. He was 16 years after the founding of the bank, 13 years after the discovery of the egg, and 7 years prior to his death. So the material that's in the book was contemporaneous with his life. And so that makes it kind of special. So bear with me on a couple quotes and just keep that in the back of your head as when John does the deep dive into sort of the nuts and bolts of his life. Here's the first quote. Mr. Ladd was always giving me something, doing me some favor, speaking kind words to me, encouraging me, giving me to understand that my chances in the world were just as good as anybody's, provided that I kept at school and did right. Another quote. He had devoted much time to the study of geology, mineralogy, and nature, and has acquired one of the finest private collections of minerals, antiquities, and Indian relics in New Hampshire. Notwithstanding his penchant for science, he is a thorough New Englander in practicality and enjoys himself in constant occupation. Another quote. The good accomplished by Mr. Ladd's zealous and persevering efforts in founding this bank, meaning Meredith Village Savings Bank, has been very great and will only be appreciated at its full value when looked upon by those of a coming time. meaning folks like us looking back at his accomplishments. And then finally, he was described as most kind and attentive in his family relations, liberal in all matters public and public improvements, and no man in Meredith has stronger friends. So we hope that John's dive into the life of this fellow will add substance to those very descriptive adjectives about who was Seneca Lad. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to John, and off we go.
Thank you, John. So Seneca Lad, Meredith, he really was quite a guy, and I think as we get into his story, you get a sense that his life through the 19th century mirrored a lot of what was going on for everybody in Meredith and Meredith Village. So Lad's story is one of those timeless ones of a self-made man. In the 19th century was a difficult time. Lad came from humble beginnings. He faced a number of triumphs and disasters along the way. He made major contributions to his fellow townsmen, and he was a man who wore many hats. He was an apprentice, a laborer, a business owner, a manufacturer, a banker, a civic leader, an antiquarian, an archaeologist, and a few others along the way. Seneca first came to Meredith Village in 1836, and we use that as a reference point. This map is the 1770 survey that was completed by Ebenezer Smith. At the time, the square is where Meredith Village would be. At the time, Meredith Village was totally deserted. Going back prior to Lad's arrival, I wanted to set the stage a little bit so you get the sense of a run-up of how Meredith Village developed and then what his role was in it. The township of Meredith was granted in 1748. At that time, nobody was living in central New Hampshire. There were no towns, no people. The Abenaki had been driven to the Canadian border. All the colonial population was established around the seacoast in New Hampshire. By 1763, after the last French and Indian War, which had kept the center of the state deserted, English won. The first settlers arrived in the Meredith Township. And they arrived at the bottom there, the early Meredith farmers along Parade Road, what we know as Parade Road. Most of that land is part of Laconia now. In 1773, the road was built from the Province Road, which is our Parade Road, through Meredith Village over to the Moulton Borough border. At the time, Joseph Center was a leading colonial settler there. But that road served to open up what became the village. Prior to that time, nobody was in the village. In 1780, or by 1780, Meredith Village had a population of 1. A gentleman by the name of Asa Foster, who merely squatted there. He did not own the land. Most of the land that became Meredith Village was actually owned by Ebenezer Smith. In 1787, Smith, with the assistance of a settler named John Jennis, built a sawmill on Measley Pond Brook. And today that's known as Corliss Brook. Comes in behind the fire department in town. Has no water to speak of. But in those days, that was a connection between Waukee and Winnipesaukee. Water power was always the key to forming a village. If you had power, you could establish mills. First mills, in every town were a sawmill and a grist mill. The town of Exeter, one of the earliest for decades, all they had was a sawmill and a grist mill. Without those two, towns couldn't flourish, and villages were not established. The critical element involved here is simply that Waukee is about 40 to 50 feet higher in elevation than Winnipesaukee. So as we all learned at some point in our careers, water flows downhill, and that created the water valley. During the 1790s and early 1800s, the village began to flourish. Again, you can see the core area that is the village. In the middle of the village became the so-called mill lot. If you ever spend any time looking at the deeds, and I'm sure all of you like to do that in your spare time, like I do, you'll see references to the mill lot. It was Ebenezer Smith's lot, number 38, and every part of town had a number for its lot, and that's how you can identify, if you ever go back to look for your heirs, how to find out where they were living. The early Meredith town population, and this is 1800, was slightly more than 1,600 people. Meredith Village, by that time, had about 100, 125 people. There was a sawmill, a grist mill, and a fulling mill. There were also various retail stores that were being established on Main Street. That 1773 road is Main Street leading into Plymouth Street. Plymouth Street was part of that main road as well. And retail stores and other trades were established, blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, and so on. Oops. Okay, in 1808, John Bond Swayze began to transform the village. This was when he was a little bit older. He was a younger man at this time. But John Bond began buying up the mill lot and all the land from Meredith Village to Measley Pond. Measley Pond was the name for Lake Waukee-Pond in those days. And Swayze's idea was that the Corliss Brook or Measley Pond Brook that had the first mills was kind of a meandering stream. It wasn't generating a lot of power. And Swayze was smart enough to recognize that if he followed the inlet or outlet off of Measley Pond, the cove, and built a canal straight down, he could capture a much higher waterfall and establish much greater power. And with much greater power, he can bring in more businesses and bigger businesses. And so he had that vision, and he followed through on it. Meredith Center of Commerce, when he finished it, moved from, say, over near where the firehouse is now. It moved to where Mill Falls is located. So that's where the waterfall is. Pretty soon, the village continued to grow. A guy named Joseph Smith from Dover, he was known as the Merchant of the Lake. Joseph Smith had stores in Alton, Wolfboro, and Lakeport. In about 1822, he set up a store in Meredith Village. He hired a guy named Joseph Ella. For those of you who follow Meredith history, Joseph Ella was one of the key movers and shakers in town. Joseph Ella had to retire because of health issues, and so Joseph Smith hired Joseph W. Lang, and the Lang name is one of the critical names in all of Meredith history, ranks right up there with Seneca Ladd and Ebenezer Stevens and a few others, as we shall see. By the early 20s, the mill lot consisted of a sawmill, a grist mill, a carding mill, a fulling mill, and a clothing mill. By this time, the population of the village was somewhere around 200, 225 people, so it kind of doubled. The population of the town as a whole was just over 2,400 people. So we're seeing a period of very rapid growth in Meredith and in the entire region, although Meredith was considered the fastest growing town around. As it grew, more businesses were willing to move in. I missed the slide. So you can see the Swayze Canal and down below the Measley Brook, and that's where the Center of Commerce moved over the Swayze Canal. Okay, as the village grew in importance, but John Bond Swayze died in 1828. His wife Alice took over running the business, which was quite unusual in those days. She ran it for 4 years. In 1832, she sold it to Captain Daniel Smith of New Hampton. And what's interesting there is what you're seeing is an influx of outside business people recognizing the potential that John Bond Swayze created, and they move in to operate the businesses in the town. In 1833, the steamboat Belknap was launched in Lakeport. It began making stops 3 times a week in Meredith. So Meredith had become an important place for the steamboat to make regular stops like that. Interestingly, the agent for the Belknap happened to be Joseph W. Lang. So he knew the town pretty well. In 1834, cotton mill was established, and that cotton mill building formed part of what is today's Mill Falls Marketplace. So that building is core that goes back into the 1830s, if not the 1820s. 1834, the Baptist Church was built on Main Street, right next to the library up here, and the buildings on Main Street, many stores, were built first in the 20s, but they proliferated through the 1830s. So as the town grew, Seneca Ladd, either having good guidance or just as much being a pretty smart guy, at still a very young age, decided that he would move to Meredith. He was still a young boy of 17. By background, his beginnings were very inauspicious. He was born in Loudon in 1819. He was the 6th child, the 4th son of Gideon and Polly Ladd. His father was a carriage maker. His father was also a lineal descendant of Daniel Ladd, who happened to arrive in Massachusetts in 1623. For an education, Seneca Ladd went to local schools in Loudon. Seneca is one of those guys, one of those kids you describe as bright, but could care less about reading school books. He was smart, but he wasn't interested in classwork. But when he found a topic he liked, he really dug into it. He was a curious guy, and he was a self-studier. In 1832, still at the age of 13, still living in Loudon, he was apprenticed to a carriage maker in the town of Raymond. And he spent parts or most of the next 4 years learning the carriage trade in Raymond. In 1836, he came to Meredith to work for a gentleman by the name of John Haynes. John Haynes happened to be a carriage maker. So there was a natural connection there. It was a small world, I'm sure. John Haynes lived on Main Street. His house was basically in the vicinity of the Advent Christian parking lot on Lower Main Street, near where Sunshine and Pods is, that vicinity. And Seneca worked with him for almost 2 years. And you might just note the proximity of John Haynes on Lower Main and Plymouth Street there for future reference. But after only about, after 2 years, he moved to Boston in 1838. And he took a job, a manufacturing job, at Timothy Gilbert's piano factory in Boston. Gilbert was a pretty well-known piano manufacturer. His was the second such piano operation in the country. And is considered one of the most historically important piano manufacturers in this country. It was an era when piano ownership was beginning to come into vogue. But the question is, Ladd is often seen as someone who recognized the value of the piano and was ahead of his time. I think the reality was that Ladd had an older brother named Albert W., and Albert W. happened to be working at Gilbert's in the piano business and learning the trade. And we'll see fairly after a while how that becomes important. Meanwhile, like many others, Seneca got tired of Boston after about 6 months and had to move back to Maryland. And I think that's a story everybody here can understand. He was still only 19 years old, but during his work for John Haynes, he had met some other Meredithites who were involved in the carriage business. And so, still, as I say, only 19 years old, he joined with 3 local men to establish his own carriage business. The 3 men were Sewell Smith, Stephen Hawkins, and Luke Furnham, and they all lived on Plymouth Street. They acquired an old sawmill that was located on the intersection of Plymouth Street and Route 3, right back out here. So on your way home in the darkness, you can take a close look at it. The mill was powered by Hawkins Brook, and this is a fairly recent picture on the right. And if you look closely, it's hard to see it when you're going down Plymouth Street. You get a little better view from Route 3 heading into town. This was a little bit early in the spring before the leaves came out. But there's a pretty good drop-off if you look at it from Plymouth Street all the way down into Prescott Park. So there was enough of a drop-off to create water power, and the Hawkins had put up at least 2 dams upstream. And they would, the whole approach to damming was in the springtime, you'd wait for the runoff, you'd allow it to back up, and then you gradually open the dams. And a lot of the mill work was done in the springtime while there was still a lot of flow of water. On the left, that's an excerpt from Ebenezer Smith's 1770 survey. And I just want to point out that that's on lot 22. We are on lot 22 right now. Most of Plymouth Street is on lot 22. Seneca's key partner was Sewell Smith. This is a picture of his headstone, which is located in the Meredith Village Cemetery, very near Route 3. Sewell Smith was the old man in the group. He was 27 when Ladd moved up here, 8 years older than Ladd, but he was an experienced wainwright or carriage maker. He was the son of the Congressional Church minister, David Smith. They lived on Plymouth Street. And their business, as best I could tell, was pretty much an immediate success. Ladd was apparently an avid salesman. He would regularly take strings of wagons as they were built, 5 to 10 of them, and he would head out and visit all the towns that were necessary to sell every one of them, and then he would come back. As he got into this business, as often happens, Ladd's personal responsibilities changed pretty dramatically in the 1840s. He married Susan Tilton in 1840. His daughter Frances was born in 1842, and his son Charles was born in 1847. Susan Tilton was the daughter of Stephen Tilton, who owned the Village Inn, which was located about where Waldron's bait shop was located, and the Advent Christian parking lot is. 1840, Ladd purchased his first home. The home was 91 Plymouth Street. I don't know that any part of that house goes back to Ladd's purchase time, but that property was definitely where Ladd purchased his first house, and it wasn't very far from the mill. Interestingly, the price of the house was $750. He bought it from Hiram Stevens, who was the minister of the Baptist Church. And $750 was to be paid over 5 years. But what was unique in this particular deed of sale was that he paid for it in wagons. And every year, he would have to build enough wagons to cover 1/5 of the sales price. Usually the deeds, and by usually, I've looked at a lot of them, they talk in terms of dollars. You rarely see this spelled out in terms of how he worded it. But he's still a very young guy. He's about 21 years old at this stage. And, that's no easy task to figure out how to buy a house, raise a family, run a mill, and so on. But during the latter 40s and into the early 1850s, Ladd suffered a huge, just an extended series of disastrous setbacks, enough to really, knock down just about anybody. So first, in 1847, his key partner, Sewell Smith, died. In 1848, Seneca Ladd's father died. In 1850, his wife, Susan, died. In 1850, the carriage factory burned to the ground, probably was not insured. In 1851, his son, Charles, died. As a result, Seneca sold the house on Plymouth Street, and he also sold what remained of the carriage business and got out of that entirely. But as we find out, Seneca Ladd was a really resilient guy. In 1852, he remarried, this time Catherine Wallace of Henniker. He moved to 45 Main Street. That's the Ladd Building. It's called the Ladd Building. That's the building that the Meredith Historical Society presently occupies. And he decided to enter the piano and melodeon business. So this is his second major business. The key reason he chose to do that was his brother Albert. So Albert had stayed with Timothy Gilbert through the 30s, and in 1848 he established his own piano manufacturing company in Boston. And Albert had become world known for the quality of the pianos that he made. And in fact, if you look on the internet, you can still find an Albert W. Ladd piano on sale for $45,000. As kind of an aside, just when you think about the history of the town and the village, what made the business possible for Seneca Ladd to make pianos for his brother in Boston was the railroad. The railroad arrived in Meredith in 1849, but it now became competitive to ship his product to Boston. And I think at the end of the day, it was Albert who convinced Seneca to go into this piano business. And so he had a ready-made business going for him. And Seneca was nothing if not a really great craftsman. Seneca's business was quite successful early on. It began in a barn behind 45 Main Street. He grew pretty quickly. By 1853, he had rented space in the mill lot and expanded it. He was advertising in Concord papers for additional workers. He had a sales force or a workforce of about 30 people. And one of the people he hired was a gentleman by the name of George H. Clark. And again, for those who follow early Meredith history, George Clark went on to develop his own lumber company that was located at the base of Dover Street. It was a dominant feature of the bay during the 1800s. But in Ladd's business, the melodeon was the piece, I think, that probably led to his greatest success. Even more so than the piano. Melodeon is a small reed organ. It's part of the accordion family. It was, compared to a piano, it was smaller, lighter, cheaper, and easier to play. By the 1850s, reed organs, especially the melodeon, had become a major source of musical entertainment in American homes. You can see this is a Ladd ad for the melodeon. Unlike the piano, the melodeon seldom needed maintenance or tuning. It was virtually indestructible in normal use. Its population spread like wildfire. And you find this tidbit, a historian pointed out that soon hundreds of thousands of Americans were acquiring melodeons, a phenomenon not unlike the spread of home television sets during the 1850s, something that many of us can kind of relate to. With success came prosperity. Ladd acquired the lot between 45 Main Street and the Congregational Church on Highland Street. If you look at that lot today, which is vacant, you wonder how that house got fit in there, but it did. And Ladd lived there for the rest of his life. As an aside, that house burned in about 1963. The church acquired it and cleared the lot, and it's an open property. But as was Ladd's fate, his life changed again in 1859. He was becoming increasingly deaf. The piano mill, his piano mill, which was the cotton mill, burned at least partially, putting a damper on his manufacturing capabilities. So thereafter, Ladd quickly phased out of the piano and melodeon business during the 1860s. It's unclear exactly how that process played out. His daughter suggested he sold the business to John A. Lang, and there was also a man named Robinson who was in the piano manufacturing business, so that stayed in Meredith thereafter. But undaunted, Ladd shifted his focus to larger corporate affairs, and two of these are the Meredith Mechanic Association and the Meredith Village Savings Bank. The Mechanic Association came along not long after the separation of Laconia from Meredith. That was in 1855. So all of a sudden, Meredith lost about 40% of its population, down to about 2,000 people. The village was about a population of about 600, and the village clearly was a driving force, or the driving force between what is today Meredith. But the mill lot, where all these mills were in disrepair. The cotton mill had burned down. The owner at the time was a man named James P.F. Smith. James lived in the house just across the street. When you go out these doors, you look across the street, that was James' house. But he lacked the capital to get the mill lot going again. So Seneca became a key participant with some of the other leading Meredith leading lights to organize the Meredith Mechanic Association. And here you can see from this map that we're really talking about the territory between Dover Street and basically Main Street. That was the so-called mill lot. That's where the canal ran through, and on either side of the canal was where the mills and other stores were located. You can see at the base of Dover Street, steamboat there. This map is from 1860. In Initially, with the Meredith Mechanic Association, Ladd was a shareholder, had a little role in the very beginning, 1859, 1860, seemed to take a back seat for the next decade, but in the 1870s, he took on the leading role in that organization. He was voted treasurer, a position he held from 1871 to about 1879 when the association was sold. He was also voted agent in 1872. The agent was the manager, the CEO was responsible for all the activities and getting things done. And Ladd was extremely successful. It's a relative term, but he was extremely successful in doing that. He lured from Rhode Island the American Twist Drill Company, and then in 1876 he was responsible for bringing Sam Hodgson to the town. This is Hodgson's building. It was built new after he arrived by the Meredith Mechanic Association. It employed upwards of 160 people, and this was probably the era of strongest prosperity within the village of Meredith. Ladd stayed active with the Meredith Mechanic Association until 1889. That was about the time that Hodgson's mill burned to the ground, and the association was sold to a new group of shareholders after that. But Ladd's perhaps greatest and longest lasting achievement was the Meredith Village Savings Bank, which was established in 1869. Ladd's daughter, oldest daughter, writing in 1914 to her sister, said, quote, "The Meredith Village Savings Bank had its inception in the busy brain of our dear father, and which under his fostering care, assisted by other loyal hearts, survives them all, being one of the greatest factors for good that our dear old town possesses." In 1885, another contemporary historian wrote that Ladd had the bank, built the bank, particularly, quote, to encourage young people in whose welfare he always took a special interest, in habits of prudence and thrift in the use of their earnings. This enterprise, conceived and carried out in his Ladd's maturity, seems to have been the great good bequeathed to the citizens of Meredith. Ladd served as treasurer of the bank from 1869 to 1889. The bank was located initially on the second floor of 45 Main, again, the building that the Historical Society is in now. This is the office. That's Ladd's youngest daughter, Virginia, who worked at the bank for many, many years. You can see the picture of Ladd on the back wall there. And the case contains many, many of his relics. And if you look really closely, you could probably spot the mystery stone on that shelf.
That's a joke. Just,
But it could be that. The Meredith Village Savings Bank was not the first bank in the Lakes region by any stretch. First bank was chartered in 1831. It was the Winnipesaukee Savings Bank, which became the Laconia Savings Bank and is now Bank of New Hampshire. Ladd had actually originally petitioned the state to form a bank in Meredith in 1857, again, just after Laconia separated. But for whatever reasons, the politics of the day, the state assembly denied that. So in 1869, when he set up this bank, he was supported by Joseph W. Lang, who became president of the bank, Ebenezer Stevens, J.W. Beatty, all the same names who were involved in the Mechanic Association. From its inception, Meredith Village Savings Bank has been dedicated to good corporate citizenship. It was designed to promote local savings and responsible financial responsibility. Ladd was a very strong believer in financial discipline. Meredith Village Savings Bank has prospered remarkably, and it's still here 150 years later. It survived. There was a quasi-depression in the 1890s. The bank lost 40% of its deposits, which in most cases would be a death blow. Survived it. It survived World War I, World War II, the Depression. It survived New Hampshire's bank calamity in 1991, when 4 of the state's largest banks failed and the other 3 were on their knees. The bank also survived the worldwide financial calamity of 2008. And you can only do that through a lot of self-discipline and knowing exactly what your mission is. And that mission is serving your local community, being successful but not chasing profits, because that's what gets banks in trouble. The bank grew steadily from its inception in 1924. It moved across the street. The top picture on the left was 45 Main Street, and it moved to the corner opposite where the town hall is now located. In 1941, branches were built, wings were built on either side of it as it continued to grow. 1958, having outgrown that space, it moved down to Winnipesaukee Street at the end of the bay. In 1994, it played a key part, it's near and dear to our hearts in the Historical Society, really being the key partner in obtaining, together with the town and the CDFA, ownership of 45 Main Street and deeding it over to the Meredith Historical Society to serve as one of the civic anchors for the whole village. And again, we're very grateful to the bank for that. Its last major piece of growth, physical growth, was building the Seneca Lad building in 2006, again on Winnipesaukee Street. And oftentimes, I know we're all busy driving down that street and don't even look up and realize that Seneca Lad's name is on the building. But it's a great memorial to Lad in that respect. In 2013, Meredith Village joined a holding company, basically affiliated with Merrimack County Savings Bank, and the holding company is in the Hampshire Mutual Bank Corp with a couple other members in, but another method to ensure its long-term success. So this year, Meredith Village celebrates its 150th anniversary. Lad would be extremely proud. That is not lipstick, by the way. It is a weak attempt to make a smile on his face. But he would be very proud of what he has left behind. Seneca Lad died in 1892. He's buried in the Meredith Village Cemetery. The rest of his family is buried there as well. His headstone is very visible from Route 3, right across from the main gate, and right near Genesee Road on the opposite side. But before his death, Lad was also a collector of relics, and in many respects he might be better known for that. He had a large collection of Native American and other artifacts, and one of those is the famous Mystery Stone. And I will now turn the program over to John to fill us in.
First off, what do we think we know about the Mystery Stone? We know that the Mystery Stone was discovered in 1872. That's fairly well documented. We know that the discovery is attributable to Seneca Lad, who at the time of the discovery would have been about 53 years old. We know that there's been considerable examination of the stone ever since. We'll touch on that a little bit tonight. We know that in 1927, Lad's eldest daughter, Frances Ladd Coe of Center Harbor, donated the stone to the State Historical Society. And a tidbit we got off the state's website is that the but not the state's website, but the State Historical Society's website, is that the Mystery Stone annually solicits more inquiries and interest than any other item in their vast collection. So that's kind of mind-boggling when you think about that. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time, and we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers and photographs of the stone. But I want to go back to some of the earlier accounts of the stone and its discovery. Some things that aren't, there's a lot of blogs, there's a lot of websites that will address various aspects of the stone, but the early accounts of the stone typically don't get developed in those articles. So I wanted to share a little bit of that with you. So the first item, in June 12, 1872, this gentleman, Tapley, reports at a field meeting of the Essex Institute about this discovery. So an operative date here is June 12, 1872. It's been confirmed by this Mr. Tapley in the minutes of this proceeding of the discovery. In that set of minutes, if you will, Mr. Tapley indicates that there is a tapered hole through its longest diameter. He describes the stone as being an Indian relic. He indicates that it was found by Seneca lad at the bottom of a post hole that was being dug by some of his employees. The stone was found embedded in clay and deposited at the head of Lake Winnipesaukee. We get a little more information later on, but he's starting to give us some sense of location as to where the egg was found. In this early set of records of this meeting, he describes the egg as a gorget, or gourget, I'm not exactly how you pronounce it, it's a French word. It has something to do with throat. Courgette. And the meaning of this term evolves from a sort of a protection device for the throat, and in more contemporaneous times it describes more of a jewelry, more of something that would be hung by the throat to suggest some status. He describes its height and its weight, the type of stone it is. He describes carvings, including a face in relief with similar features to Mexican Indian masks. He describes a representation of arrows, a new moon, a convolute or a coil, which in his opinion may represent a serpent, a wigwam, a circle representing a full moon, in his opinion, the ear of corn, a depressed circle, the head of an animal, etc., etc. Interestingly enough, at this early juncture in all of this speculation, is the very onset of speculation, he notes that although everyone has the privilege of forming his or own theories in regards to the significance of the symbols, and that's a little bit prophetic because we're here tonight still in the same boat that he was in 1872. Tapley describes Mr. Ladd as a naturalist, and the way the minutes are constructed, it certainly suggests that they spoke directly, because he describes Ladd as having described the egg with enthusiasm. Tapley concluded that the discovery was one of the greatest of importance in terms of archaeological bearings. It's interesting, at the very end of these minutes, somebody chimes in by the name of F.W. Putnam, who was in attendance at that meeting, and he suggests that these drawings, so now there's a reference to drawings that you're going to see in a second. So there's some kind of drawings that were done a week or so after the discovery by this fellow Tapley that were far more elaborate than anything known as work of the earliest inhabitants of New England. So he's now starting to speculate that this is not a Native American Indian artifact from local Indians, and was inclined to think that it might be the work of some other race other than the American Indian from New England. Putnam also goes on to speculate that based upon its shape and having a hole through its center, that it would be classed with the singular perforated stones called gorgets, found throughout the country. So here again, this is the very onset of speculation. Tapley goes on, so this is June of 1872. He writes an article in the American Naturalist, which is a scientific journal, in November of that same year. And so he starts to expand upon his understanding of how the stone came to be discovered in this journal article. He writes that a friend of his, someone by the name of J.F. Bly, Esquire, visited a fish breeding establishment of Jaziel Robinson at Meredith Village. So it's another thread that we went down for a while. We hadn't heard of this particular fish hatchery, but come to find out that there was a very substantial fish hatchery in Meredith. It sort of made sense with this account. At that time, they had inquired whether there's anything of scientific interest, and they were referred to Ladd and his stone. So he goes on to say that about June 1, Ladd was causing the digging of these post holes. So now we tie it back a little bit tighter to when this may have been discovered. And so he's, if you go back to think of his first field meeting that I mentioned, his first account, that was published on June 12th. That was a meeting of June 12th. So now he's referring to the discovery having occurred around June 1st. So basically, he was writing within 10 days or so of the actual discovery. So it's a very contemporaneous accounting of how and where the stone was found. And that's why I wanted to spend more time sharing with you these two accounts, because it starts to drill in a little bit deeper in terms of how and where the stone was found. So about June 1st, Ladd was causing the digging of post holes for a fence when a laborer threw out what was apparently a lump of clay, and this attracted Ladd's attention. It was cleaned and obviously then determined that it had some archaeological significance. He describes Ladd as being delighted with the discovery. He describes Ladd as being quite the naturalist and having an extensive private collection of relics and specimens. He describes the stone being found at about 2 feet in depth, and there's other accounts that refer to it as being 6 feet deep. So here again, I think this is interesting because this is a contemporaneous accounting based upon an interview with Ladd as to the circumstances around the discovery. So 2 feet deep, describes it as being in oval form, and suggests that it's perfect in shape as if turned on a lathe. So he starts to speculate now that this was a lathe product. He describes what I'm referring to as the boreholes. He describes a hole that was drilled through the longest diameter, which tapered uniformly from 3/8 inch at the wider base of the egg to 1/8 at the top. He also notes that the sculpture is of higher grade than would be attributed to Indian workmanship. So this is a view of that same map that John had. This is what was referred to as the Woodford map. It was published, I think, 1860. So it was in development for a year or two, obviously, before it got published. And this brook here is the brook that runs by our fire station. And so originally it was discussed as being found at the head of Meredith Bay. And then in this second account, he specifically described it as being in that vicinity of where the lake used to end up emptying into the bay. Because at the time when this was being written, the canal had already been dug. So we have a little more clarity as to where the stone was found. There's a lot of other interpretive value on that map. I'm not going to bother you with that tonight, but we can locate where Seneca Ladd lived. We can locate the church. We can locate the mills. We can locate many of those things that John was referring to on this map. Now, this map was published 12 years before the egg's discovery, but if we assume that not a whole hell of a lot happened during the Civil War, this general layout of the village was probably pretty similar to what was the case 12 years later. So I mentioned that in November, that in the first discussion, Tapley referred to sketches. The sketches actually appeared in the November 1872 publication. So these are the sketches that were done when Tapley visited Ladd in about early June of 1872. A couple things to point out. Notice the top and bottom, you'll see the boreholes, and you'll see the etched rings around the boreholes. So those are two of the engravings. And then the face. The face is a quote-unquote Indian mask having a characteristic outline and projecting mouth, as in other specimens of Indian art. This is the interpretation of that particular image. This particular view, lines of the wigwam are pricked up or roughened. And so when you get a chance to look at that, take a close look at the line work on the wigwam. You'll see relief relative to that part of the engraving. And his opinion here again is that rounded feature represents a full moon. Here we have the 4 arrows and 2 dots underneath that may represent, or again, his opinion, stars, and below this are 2 more arrows crossed and a coil, which may represent the serpent that I mentioned before. Here we have the ear of corn, and what I encourage you when you get a chance to look at the stone, take a very close look at the detail in that ear of corn. You have individual kernels that are carved in this little image on this little stone to an incredible level of detail. So please definitely take a look at the kernels of corn that are on the stone. We also have a depressed circle with 3 figures. You know, what do those figures mean? A deer's leg, perhaps. And then there's a lot of speculation on what those other 2 mean. It's pretty difficult to try to figure that out. So Tapley concludes by saying, as an illustration of the surmises of those who are interested in deciphering such inscriptions, we give the following account, which is certainly ingenious and even plausible. So here in November of 1872, he provides this suggestion. It is suggested that the stone commemorates a treaty between 2 tribes. The reverse arrows symbolize peace, the moon and stars, the date, the crossed arrows, a union of the 2 forces for aggressive or defensive purposes. The wigwam might indicate the place where the treaty was consummated, and the corn and other emblems, the feast by which it was commemorated. So there's a early on 1872 suggestion of what he thought the symbology represented. So when I started earlier on, I mentioned a few quotes about Mr. Ladd, and I just wanted to return to this for a second. This is a very often cited volume with that 10-chapter history that I mentioned before, and it does have a section within that book called A Curious Relic, as well as a biographical sketch of this fellow Seneca Ladd. So here again, keep in mind that at the time of this publication, Seneca Ladd was alive. He was at age 66, 7 years prior to his passing, and the accounts of his life and the relic were contemporaneous to his life. So what does the history of Merrimack and Belknap counties and the 10-chapter town history add to the mystery? Well, in that publication, the editor's name is Hurd, so we often refer to it as Hurd. For those of us that dig into the town's history, that's a often cited publication. So in the Hurd publication, the relic was found in a post hole dug in the trail of the Indians between Lake Winnipesaukee and Waukee. So at this point, we're not talking it as Measley Pond, but it's also anecdotally suggested that the connectivity between Waukee and Meredith Bay was a area of Indian activity because of the proximities to both lakes. So that makes some sense. But here again, first it was described as Meredith Bay, then it was described by the brook, the original outlet, and then now we hear of its reference relative to the area of an old Indian trail. The Hurd publication suggests that it was not done on the lathe, as it deviates slightly from a quote-unquote solid of revolution. So now there's somebody else speculating that it was not lathe based. Hurd describes a conical hole passing along the axis, but then adds that it lacks nearly 1/8 of an inch of being concentric with the base, and a little less at the summit. Hurd describes the workmanship as being inferior to the gems of ancient Europe, but much superior to any other found on this continent, citing the details of the ear of corn. Hurd refers to the scalp of an animal with large ears, which was not speculated by Tapley. Regarding the face, the Hurd publication describes it as strongly resembling Egyptian facial features, and suggests 4 spears or paddles represent the letter M, and the 2 other arrows form the letter X, suggesting that the relic may be the work of someone living in prehistoric days, as nothing like it has been produced by Indian tribes of this locality. And then, importantly, he confirms that in 1885, the stone had already attracted the wonder of the scientific world. So things started happening pretty rapidly once the word was out that this strange thing had been found. As I indicated before, the stone has been in the custody of the Historical Society down in Concord since 1927. So there's a few more things to share with you on that. In 1931, a gentleman by the name of Kenneth Roberts wrote to the Historical Society theorizing that the stone was a thunderstone. So here's another speculation. In general terms, thunderstones were kind of, in my words, maybe folklorish kind of thing about stones falling out of the sky, because farmers would find these stones in their fields. And then I guess later it was sort of understood that maybe these were Indian relics that were being found by farmers. But in 1931, someone suggested this was a stone that, one of the most perfect examples of a stone, actually it was the most perfectly worked thunderstone ever discovered, having fallen from the sky. Studies were done by the State Historical Society in 1994, particularly looking at those holes that were drilled. There was a bore scope analysis done, and they documented several features. One, that the stone was bored from both ends, which we already knew, with different size bits, because we knew that there were 2 different diameters going in. That each bore is straight, not tapered, and that the intersection of the 2 bores forms a round profile. And finally, that there is a square divot, which is referred to as a key, about halfway through the length of the stone. So if you look at these 2 images that were developed, the left side is obviously a superimposition of the bore holes on one of those graphics that Tapley did. And the second is a sketch from somebody who was a participant in that process. And if you look at that bottom circle, you see that on the right-hand side of the little circle, a divot in that circle, that's the quote-unquote anomaly that they found when they were looking through the bore scope. So there's something in that view that they had that to this day still is not explained. Well, why do we have anomalies inside something that was drilled into the middle? Also in '94, a gentleman by the name of Eugene Baudet, former state geologist, examined the stone and concluded that it's probably quartzite of a type not readily recognizable as a New Hampshire rock, but could not rule out New Hampshire as the source. It starts to sound like the Mueller report. So nothing terribly definitive there. Additional notes that were part of that review was that it was turned on the lathe, so it wasn't lathe driven. Carving done after turning, and that the carving could have been done with either power tools or hand tools using tungsten carbide or diamond tips or drill bits. So the most prevalent speculation is that it's some kind of prehistoric Native American artifact. However, there's a lot of contradiction to even that premise. The anomaly of the stones, possibly machine-made carvings, and the fact that it was composed of a rock not found typically in New Hampshire, can't be explained, and don't really support the notion that it was Native American. If you have a chance, if you really want to dive into it, you can Google this and find out way more speculation than you could ever imagine. I had the pleasure of having to do that to get ready for tonight. But many of the enthusiasts that speculate on this think that it does have some kind of spiritual significance, that the stone may depict that forging of a treaty between two tribes, or that it may have been part of a ritual that accompanied a water burial. They're trying to explain how did this end up on essentially the shores of Lake Winnipesaukee, and perhaps it had some kind of relevance to a water burial. The New Hampshire Historical Society, not the Meredith Historical Society, suggested it could also possibly be a hoax perpetuated by Mr. Ladd. We'll ask Wes to speak to that. I'm just kidding. Since Ladd never made any money off the stone and garnered little fame for his association with it, it's hard to see this as being a hoax that somebody of his character that we just spent half an hour sharing with you would try to perpetuate. But when there is no resolution as to what the stone is, that's one possibility that's been thrown out there. A couple more recent speculations is that it's a lodestone. Admittedly, I don't quite get this one, but a lodestone is an element of very early compasses that dated to 1250 to 1600 BC that were used for navigational purposes, particularly by the Portuguese and the Danish, in that the carvings being what the explorers observed when they were, this one speculation, they were in the Dakotas, part of our country. But essentially, they would either use magnetic stone or fill a stone with some magnetic materials and incorporate that in some form of a crude compass that used to navigate ships. So that's another theory of what this stone represents, and that the magnetic material would have been some kind of powder that was placed in the stone in order to form the magnetic field for the compass. Another good one, somebody by the name of B.L. Freeman suggests online that the mystery stone is incredibly old with an ancient message. And this is about 8 or 9 pages long when you look at his article. He goes through an incredible analysis of revolutions of moons and planets, and it's hard to explain. You have to go take a look at it. But he interprets this through astronomical terms and mathematical terms and comes to a conclusion that I wanted to share with you. This is a sort of another bookmark on the whole issue of speculation. So bear with me on this one. So this is his conclusion, and I encourage you to, I have it with me, I can show it to you, and encourage you to go read it for yourself. But 9 pages later, he draws this conclusion. And this is the storytelling value of these carvings. We were a contemplative people who lived on a planet 7,910 miles in diameter that turned at a fixed rate around the sun of a diameter of 864,000 miles. And this place we called home. We measured our world in the heavens with rays of longitude. It was perfection. Our lives were complete until the day the meteorites came. And then the comet struck. We saw them coming. There were 2 which impacted the planet, our home. Because of the impact, the earth was shucked like an ear of corn. The surface turned. The planet was raped and burnt. The ground split asunder. The mountains spewed forth flames. The people and all that lived were engulfed by the oceans. Nothing was spared. The deluge was upon the land. We swam and watched the animals drown. We swam until we could not hold on. We all perished. Our homes, our peace, our happiness, our knowledge, all gone. We remember, we lament, we remember, we lament. They will return, the dangers around us at all times. So on that pleasant note, good evening. No, I'm just kidding. So anyway, I just share that with you. That's a whole nother realm. But if you go online, there's tons of additional speculation as to what this thing's all about. So what is the origin of the stone? Is it Native American? Is it Mexican? Is it Egyptian? It's been suggested as being Eskimo, Aztec. It's been suggested as being a gorget. Thank you. It's been suggested as being a thunderstone, the lodestone, the compass scenario. It's been suggested as possibly being a hoax. It's been suggested as having something to do with possible Viking visits to our area. It's been suggested that it's part of that ancient water burial. It's been suggested that it's a storytelling device alluding to the destruction of civilization. So what do we conclude? What do we think we know now? Well, the Mystery Stone, the one thing that people agree on is that it's an out-of-place artifact, quote unquote, meaning that it's not something that you would think would have been discovered where it was. We also can conclude that the age, purpose, and origins of the stone remain unclear. Its meaning continues to elude any definitive translation. So as much as we can speculate, we're still back to where everybody was in 1872, really not knowing exactly what they were looking at. So we encourage you to speculate yourselves as to what you think it might be. And finally, as we wrap up, we wanted to wish our friends at the Meredith Savings Bank a happy birthday. I think it's a great accomplishment. And we also wanted to extend our gratitude to Les and the New Hampshire Historical Society for graciously agreeing to bring the stone up so that you can look firsthand at what this mystery is all about. And if you had any desire to contact anybody at the Historical Society or the folks in the New Hampshire Historical Society, here's our contact information. So with that, that's the end of the program, and we'd be happy to take any questions. And Wes, if you want to come on up and catch a few bullets, please feel free to join us. So thank you.